Humanity remained silent for centuries, until one message shook the galaxy. The alarm did not ring gently. It never did at 3 in the morning, not in this place, not with this job. I was already sitting up before my eyes were fully open, my heart beating fast against my ribs, my hand reaching for the console before my brain had finished waking up. The red light on the screen was small, but it filled the whole room. In 14 years of working in the United Earth Archives, I had seen that light exactly twice. Both times, it had meant nothing. Both times, I had written a report, filed it, and gone back to bed. Something told me this time would be different. My name is Evra Solis. I am 41 years old, and I have spent the better part of my adult life sitting in a room 60 meters below the city of Geneva, reading messages that were never meant for us. That is my job. That has always been my job. I am a linguist and cryptologist for a department that does not officially exist, inside a building that is listed on public maps as a water treatment facility. My colleagues are brilliant, quiet people who prefer the company of code and frequency patterns to the company of other humans. We eat lunch at our desks. We do not talk about what we do at parties, mostly because we are not invited to parties. What we do, simply put, is listen. 300 years ago, when humanity first decoded an alien signal, the world did not celebrate. There were no parades, no speeches, no announcements. A small group of scientists sat in a cold room very much like this one, looked at what they had found, and understood immediately that they were not ready. The signals were not a greeting. They were not a warning. They were the ordinary traffic of a galaxy that had been conducting business for a very long time without us. Trade negotiations. Fleet movements. Political declarations between civilizations that had been flying between stars while humans were still arguing about which country owned which piece of dirt. The decision made in that room in 2089 changed everything that came after it. We would not respond. We would not announce ourselves. We would learn everything we could, for as long as it took, before we ever opened our mouths. The Covenant of Silence, as it came to be called, was signed by every government on Earth within 18 months. It was the most complete secret in human history. Billions of people went about their lives without knowing that their world sat inside a galaxy full of voices, and that their own government had chosen, deliberately, to say nothing back. I grew up knowing. My mother worked in the archives before me, and her father before her. I learned to read Veil script before I learned to ride a bicycle. I grew up understanding that the silence was not weakness. It was the most careful, most deliberate act of patience that any civilization had ever attempted. We were not hiding because we were afraid. We were hiding because we were studying, and we were not done yet. The Veil Dominion was the most powerful civilization in the region of space nearest to us. They controlled 42 star systems, maintained a standing fleet that could cross the distance from their home world to ours in 6 months, and had been the dominant force in galactic politics for roughly 800 years. They spoke loudly and often. Their transmissions filled the frequencies like a river fills a valley, constant, confident, and completely unaware that someone downstream was mapping every current. The Korathi Collective were older, quieter, and more dangerous. They moved in coordinated silence that made us nervous even from a distance. We had been studying their language for 60 years before we fully understood it, and what we found when we did understand it was not comforting. They thought in long timelines. Very long. They planned things across generations the way most civilizations plan things across weeks. The Pale Architects were something else entirely. Ancient. Come. They had been out there longer than either the Veil or the Korathi, and they almost never transmitted anything at all. What little we received from them was dense with meaning, layered in ways that took our best analysts years to unpack. We still had not fully understood them. I suspected we might never fully understand them. And then there were the Rethkai. Nobody paid much attention to the Rethkai. Not us, and certainly not the bigger civilizations. They were small, physically slight creatures who had developed faster than light travel before most of the others but had never shown any interest in expansion or power. They ran courier routes. They carried messages and goods between the larger powers and collected their fees and went home. They were, by every measure available to us, harmless. The galaxy treated them the way a city treats a postal service. Useful. Invisible. Completely overlooked. My screen was showing me a Rethkai transmission. That alone was strange. We received Rethkai signals occasionally, but they were always routing codes or schedule updates, the kind of ordinary administrative noise that our systems flagged and filed automatically. This one had not been filed automatically. This one had been flagged by 3 separate systems in sequence, which meant it had passed through our filters at a level of priority that I had only ever seen used twice before in my career. I pulled up the raw signal and looked at the frequency signature. It was not a routing code. It was not a schedule update. The signal was addressed, with precise and unmistakable intentionality, directly to the coordinates of Earth. I sat very still for a long moment. My coffee had gone cold beside me. Somewhere above me, 60 meters of rock and steel and ordinary city noise separated me from a world that had no idea this room existed. I thought about all the mornings I had sat here and read transmissions from beings who did not know we were listening. I thought about 300 years of silence, carefully maintained, carefully protected, passed down from generation to generation like a sacred responsibility. Then I picked up the secure line and called Director Alan Foss. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been sleeping either. "Director," I said. "We have something." "How serious?" he asked. I looked at the screen. The signal was still blinking, patient and steady, waiting. "I don't know yet," I said. "But someone out there just called us by name." There was a pause on the line. I could hear him breathing. "I'm on my way," he said. I did not put the phone down. I kept it in my hand and stared at the signal, and I felt something move through me that I could not quite name. It was not fear, exactly. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large, looking down, knowing that the next step would change everything and that there was no way to take it back once taken. In 300 years of silence, no one had ever called us by name. My hands were steady when I opened the file. My soul was not. The decryption took 4 hours, which was faster than anyone expected. I worked through it myself, side by side with 2 of my best analysts, a quiet man named Oliver Crane who had a gift for Rethkai phonological patterns, and a younger woman named Fiona Marsh who had joined our team only 2 years ago but had already proven sharper than anyone twice her age. The 3 of us sat in that underground room while the building above us slowly filled with the ordinary sounds of a morning beginning, and we took apart the signal layer by layer, like unwrapping something delicate that we were afraid might break. It did not break. It opened. The message was in Rethkai primary dialect, which was already unusual, because the Rethkai almost always used trait standard Vale script for any communication intended for external audiences. Using their own language here was a choice. It was a signal within a signal, a way of saying, "This is not for anyone else. This is only for you." Oliver read the first clean line out loud, and the room went very quiet. "We know you are there, humans. We have known for 60 years. We kept your secret. Now the Dominion is coming for both of us. You are our only hope." Nobody spoke for a moment. I read the line again on my screen. Then I read it a third time. My mind was working through the implications in order, the way I had been trained to do, setting emotions aside and focusing on information. But some part of me that was not trained, some deeper and more human part, was having trouble keeping up with what those words actually meant. The Rethkai had known about us for 60 years. 60 years. I had been born 41 years ago. When I was 19 years old and preparing to take my entrance examinations for the archives, the Rethkai had already been sitting on this secret for 19 years before that. They had known, and they had said nothing. They had carried their knowledge the way they carried everything else, quietly, professionally, without drawing attention to it. "Why?" Fiona said softly. She was not asking anyone in particular. "Because they are good at keeping secrets," Oliver said. "It is what they do." He was right, but it was more than that, and I knew it. The Rethkai had kept our secret not because they were indifferent, not because they had forgotten, but because they had made a choice. A 60-year choice. That was not casual. That was deliberate and sustained in a way that required real commitment, real understanding of why the secret mattered. They had understood us better than we had understood them. I moved past the opening lines and into the data packet attached to the message. It was enormous, far larger than the text portion, compressed into a format that took Oliver another 40 minutes to fully crack open. When it finally spread itself across our screens, all three of us leaned forward at the same time. Star maps. Hundreds of them, meticulously annotated in Rethkai script, covering a region of space that included the Veiled Dominion's full military deployment across their nearest 12 systems. Fleet positions. Supply routes. The coordinates of staging areas that even our own long-range monitoring had not fully identified. Movement projections. Timelines. And at the center of all of it, a single annotated point that pulsed like a heartbeat on the display. Rethkai home space. The Dominion's fleet was moving toward it. The arrival projection was marked clearly, 40 days. I sat back in my chair and made myself breathe slowly. 40 days was not a long time. 40 days was terrifyingly short, given what it meant and what would need to happen in response to it. I pulled up the secondary annotation files and started reading. Oliver and Fiona were doing the same, each of us taking different sections, moving fast. What I found in my section made my breath stop for a moment. The Rethkai had not only mapped the Dominion's current movements. They had accessed and copied something much more sensitive, internal Dominion expansion planning files, the kind of documents that outline strategic priorities for the next century of growth. I did not know how they had gotten them. The Rethkai had access to a great deal of galactic infrastructure in their capacity as couriers, and perhaps that access had given them opportunities that no one had thought to guard against. It did not matter how they had gotten them. What mattered was what the files said. Earth was in them. Not prominently. Not as a primary target or an imminent threat. We were listed in a category that the Dominion's planners called unclaimed developmental worlds, planets with emerging civilizations that had not yet established formal galactic presence and therefore had no legal standing under any of the agreements that governed interstellar conduct. We were listed alongside several other worlds, some of which I recognized from our own files as civilizations that had been quietly absorbed by the Dominion over the past century, their populations resettled or restructured, their resources rerouted into Dominion supply chains. They did not think of us as a threat. They did not think of us as a power or a partner or even a problem. They thought of us the way someone thinks of an empty house on a street they plan to eventually buy. We were on a list. We were a future acquisition. Fiona was the one who found the countdown embedded in the data packet's final layer, a timer running backward against a fixed timestamp. When she called it up on screen, I recognized what it was before she did. The Rethkai had set it themselves, synchronized to their own internal chronometers, an automated escalation trigger. If no response came from Earth within 72 hours of the message's arrival, the packet would self-duplicate and send itself outward on every available frequency, broadcasting everything, the star maps, the fleet movements, the Dominion's expansion files, to every receiver in range. It was not a threat. It was desperation. The Rethkai were not giving us a choice about whether to act. They were giving us a choice about how. We could respond quietly, on our own terms, in the next 72 hours. Or the galaxy would see everything, all at once, with no warning and no preparation, and the chaos that followed would be unpredictable in ways that frightened me more than the Dominion's fleet did. Director Foss had arrived 2 hours into our decryption and had been standing at the back of the room ever since, saying nothing, watching us work. When I turned to give him my summary, his face was already carrying the expression of a man who had understood most of it just from watching our faces. "We need to convene the council," I said. "I know," he said. "Tonight." "I know that too." The emergency session of the United Earth Council convened 12 hours later, in a room even further underground than mine, accessible only through a security process that most of the council members had never needed to use in their careers. I attended as a technical advisor. There were 31 people in the room, representing every major government on Earth, and most of them looked the way I felt, like someone had handed them a door they had always known existed but had never actually expected to open. The debate lasted 4 hours. Some argued for maintaining the silence, for finding a way to help the Rethkai without exposing ourselves, for continuing to gather information. Others pointed out, reasonably, that the Rethkai's countdown gave us no room for half measures. Others still pointed to the Dominion's files, to the list we were on, and made the quiet and unavoidable argument that the silence had always been a temporary condition, not a permanent one, and that perhaps the time it was designed to buy had finally run out. In the end, the vote was not close. 26-5, in favor of speaking. I walked out of that room knowing that the world I had grown up in, the quiet world, the listening world, the careful and patient and deeply secretive world, was about to change in ways that could not be undone. I was not sure whether I was frightened or ready. I think I was both. We had spent 300 years becoming the galaxy's greatest secret. In that room, we voted on whether to become its greatest surprise. My name is Kale Dran. I am 56 years old, and for the last 22 years I have commanded a fleet that has never fired a single shot in battle. There is a kind of discipline in that. A quiet pride. You train and train and train for something you hope will never be needed, and you build it to be so good that if it ever is needed, the need will be brief. Tonight, for the first time, I received orders to bring the fleet to active status. I stood at the primary command station of our Deep Space Coordination Center, buried inside a hollowed asteroid in the outer belt, and I watched the status boards come alive one by one. Green lights. All green. After 22 years, not a single system out of specification. I had good people. I had always had good people. Let me tell you what we built. Most people on Earth, even those cleared to know we were listening to the galaxy, had no idea the listening had also been teaching us how to build. Every Veil weapon system we had monitored had given our engineers a problem to solve: could we match it, improve it, or counter it? Every Karathi hull configuration we had observed had prompted the same question. We did not steal designs. We derived them. We looked at what others had built over centuries and asked ourselves what we would build if we started fresh, knowing everything they knew, without any of their inherited assumptions or institutional inertia. The answer, after 3 centuries of quiet engineering, was something the galaxy had no frame of reference for. We had 1,400 warships. They ranged from small fast interceptors to vessels large enough to carry entire battalions of ground forces and the equipment to support them. Our primary energy weapons could engage targets at ranges roughly 3 times what Dominion gunships could manage, which meant we could hit them before they were close enough to hit us back. Our hull composites had been derived from theoretical models that the Veil had never published because they had never bothered to test them. Our material scientists had worked out the physics on their own and built what the Veil had only theorized. We were faster than we should have been, better shielded than anyone would expect, and armed with systems nobody outside our program had ever seen in use. All of it was hidden. Docked in asteroid bays and dark-side lunar facilities and deep space caches, sitting silent and ready, carrying no active transponders, generating no signals that outside sensors could track. We had been invisible for 3 centuries in every sense that mattered. Tonight, I had new orders. The message we sent was not a military communication. It was not a threat, and I want to be clear about that, because clarity matters when you are introducing yourself to a galaxy for the first time. We did not announce ourselves by showing our fleet. We did not send images of our ships or lists of our weapons. We sent words, carefully chosen, delivered on the exact frequencies the Dominion used for official government-to-government communications, in perfect Veil dialect that had taken our linguists 3 generations to refine to this level of precision. The message read as follows. The Rethkai are under our protection. Any vessel crossing into their space will not return. Earth. 34 words, in Veil, broadcast across 12 frequency bands simultaneously, time to arrive at the Dominion's primary communication relay stations within minutes of each other, ensuring that no station would receive it first and have time to suppress it before the others had already logged it. I do not know exactly what happened in the Dominion's command centers when those words arrived. I can imagine it. I have spent 22 years studying their command structure, their decision-making processes, their institutional reflexes. I know how their admirals think. I know what questions they would ask, in what order, and I know what answers their intelligence apparatus would have given them, which were, essentially, no answers at all. Who is Earth? There is no record. How do they speak Veil at this level of fluency? Unknown. How do they know our fleet movements? Unknown. How are they transmitting on our secure frequencies? Unknown. Every question they asked would produce the same result. We were, to them, a complete absence of information, and for a military organization that had spent 800 years operating from a position of total informational dominance, that absence must have been deeply unsettling. The Dominion did not know how to be confused. It was not a state they had practiced. I watched the reaction from my station, through our monitoring systems that they did not know existed. I watched their fleet communications spike with traffic. I watched their command channels go dark for 6 minutes, which in Dominion operational terms meant their highest level of secure consultation was underway. I watched 3 of their vessels near the Rethkai boundary change course. Not toward the Rethkai. Away. I allowed myself a small and private satisfaction at that. The reaction from the Karathi collective was different and in some ways more interesting. They went very quiet, which for the Karathi meant they were paying extremely close attention. Within 8 hours of our transmission, their long-range sensor arrays, the ones we had been secretly monitoring for decades, shifted alignment in a pattern I recognized immediately. They were scanning the Sol system. Looking at us. Really looking, probably for the first time with full intent and focus, pulling old observatory records, running historical data through new filters. They were asking themselves how long we had been there and what they had missed. The Pale Architects did not respond at all, which was what the Pale Architects always did, and which told me nothing, which was also what the Pale Architects always did. It was the smaller civilizations that surprised me. Within 18 hours of our transmission, we began receiving signals from 4 separate minor powers, none of them among the major players, all of them clustered in regions where Dominion expansion had been most aggressive in recent decades. The signals were simple, almost crude in their directness. They wanted to know if the protection extended to them. They wanted to know if Earth was real, and permanent, and willing to stand by what it had said. I did not have the authority to answer them. That was not my job. My job was the fleet and the silence and the readiness. But I forwarded every one of those messages to the Council immediately, because they mattered in ways that went beyond anything military. Those signals were something I had not expected to feel on this night, on this of all nights. They were people asking for help. We had come out of 300 years of silence with a statement of protection for one small civilization facing an overwhelming threat. And within a day, others were raising their hands. I did not know, in that moment, where it would lead. I did not know what the Council would decide, or how the Dominion would respond beyond their initial hesitation, or what the Karathi were planning in their long and patient way. I knew my fleet was ready. I knew my crews were the best trained in the history of our program. I knew that whatever came next, we would not be found wanting. 3 Dominion scout ships were already changing course, moving from their holding positions toward the inner solar system. They would arrive within days. They were coming to see who had spoken to them in their own language and told them to turn around. I felt almost sorry for them. Almost. My name is Isel Oren, and I have spent 30 years preparing for a conversation I was told might never happen. Tonight, it is happening. I am standing in the transmission chamber aboard a station that most of the world does not know exists, wearing a jacket that I chose carefully this morning because I understood, at some level, that the jacket I wore today might be the one described in history books. That sounds vain. I do not mean it to be. I mean it in the way that a person who has spent 30 years waiting for something can become acutely aware of small details when it finally arrives. The 3 Dominion scout ships arrived at the outer edge of the solar system 41 hours after our initial message went out. They came in standard scouting formation, weapons not hot but not passive either, positioned in a configuration that the Dominion used when they expected to encounter something they did not yet fully understand. That configuration, I knew from 30 years of studying their protocols, was a significant departure from their usual approach. They normally led with dominance displays. The fact that they did not, the fact that they arrived uncertain instead of loud, told me our message had done exactly what it was intended to do. They broadcast a demand for identification within minutes of arrival. It was in Vale, high formal register, the kind of language their admirals used when addressing governments they considered to be significantly beneath them in power and standing. It was demanding and dismissive at the same time, which is a difficult combination to achieve and which the Vale had spent centuries perfecting. I waited. 30 seconds. A full minute. Not because I needed time to prepare, but because the pause itself was a message. We were not going to hurry. Then I spoke. I spoke in Vale. Specifically, I spoke in the northern coastal dialect of Vale, the dialect of the planet's administrative class, the one used in their highest councils and their oldest legal documents. It is not the dialect they use for external communications. Using it meant I had access to something most outsiders were never meant to see, and I wanted them to understand that immediately, before we had said anything else of substance. Admiral Orithvel, I said, welcome to the Sol system. I apologize for the distance. We would have offered a closer anchorage, but we thought you might prefer some space while you adjusted to the situation. The silence that followed lasted 11 minutes. I counted. 11 minutes is a very long time in a transmission exchange. It means whoever you are talking to has stopped, looked at each other, and started asking hard questions. The first question they would have asked was how I knew his name. The answer, that we had been monitoring Dominion communications long enough to know the full command roster of their scouting division, would have taken them some time to process. When the Admiral finally responded, his tone had changed. Still formal. Still measured. But the dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that the veil did not usually allow outsiders to hear from them. Caution. You have the advantage of identification over us, he said. Correct this. My name is Isel Oren, I told him. I represent the government of Earth, a world you will find documented in your own archives under the designation UD 7741C, classified as an unclaimed developmental world. I am told that designation is somewhat overdue for revision. Another pause. Shorter this time. He was starting to calibrate. You have accessed Dominion internal classification files, he said. It was not a question. We have accessed a great deal, I said. 300 years is a long time to listen. I would like to share with you the extent of what we know, because I believe it will help us have a more productive conversation than the one you were probably prepared to have when you left home. I then began to speak. Slowly, clearly, in that elegant northern coastal dialect, I walked the Admiral through a summary of what the United Earth Archives contained on the subject of the Veiled Dominion. I did not use it as a weapon. I did not present it as a threat. I presented it the way a scholar presents research, organized, specific, and accurate. I told him about treaties his government had made and broken. I told him about border disputes that his historical records had filed under different names than the civilizations on the other side used. I told him about decisions his admiralty had made in the last decade that had consequences his government's own analysts had not yet fully traced. I was careful, always, to be accurate. Nothing exaggerated, nothing speculative. Every specific claim I made was one I could have cited chapter and verse from our archive, and I believe he understood that, because at no point did he challenge a specific fact. He challenged the existence of the archive. He challenged the idea that we could have been listening for so long without detection. But he did not challenge the facts themselves, because the facts were correct and he knew it. When I finished, the silence lasted 4 minutes. What do you want? He asked. The Northern Coastal Register had slipped slightly. He was not performing anymore. The same thing everyone wants, I said. A future that is better than the present. I am extending an invitation on behalf of Earth. We would like to host a summit, here, in this system, on neutral ground, under the protection of our fleet, to discuss the framework of a new understanding between the powers of this region of space. All are welcome. All are equal at the table. No preconditions. You have a fleet, he said. Admiral, I said gently, do you honestly believe we would have sent that first message without one? The third silence lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, his response was not agreement. It was not refusal. It was something more useful than either. It was the sound of a very powerful person recalibrating, setting aside prepared scripts, and beginning to think. We will need time to consult, he said. Of course, I said. We have been waiting 300 years. We can wait a few more days. What I did not know, at that moment, was that a separate transmission was already moving through Rethkai courier channels, spreading to every minor power within range. The Rethkai themselves had begun broadcasting, openly and proudly, their own announcement. They were under Earth's protection. They used a phrase in their own language that I had never encountered before in our archives. Our analysts translated it later, and when they gave me the translation I read it 3 times. The phrase meant, roughly, the quiet ones have spoken. Within 48 hours of my conversation with Admiral Vell, 2 civilizations formally sent observers towards Sol. Neither of them were powers. Both of them were peoples who had spent decades watching the Dominion expand in their direction and wondering when it would reach them. They did not know us. They had no idea, until 48 hours ago, that we existed. But they had heard what we said to the Dominion, and they had watched the Dominion's fleet hesitate, and they were drawing the natural conclusion. The Dominion's internal communications, which we were still monitoring without their knowledge, showed something I found remarkable. Their debates were no longer about whether to continue toward the Rethkai. That question appeared to have been set aside. Their debates were now about Earth. About who we were, how long we had been listening, what we might know that they had not yet identified, and whether the summit invitation was a trap. It was not a trap. I want to be clear about that. We had no interest in traps, no interest in games, no interest in using our 300 years of knowledge as a weapon of destruction. We wanted exactly what I had said, a table, and a future, and a framework that was better than the one that already existed. But I understood why they were afraid. I understood it the way I understood everything about them, because I had spent my entire adult life learning to understand them, and now, for the first time, the understanding flowed in both directions. The Admiral's final transmission before withdrawing to consult with his government was a single question. He asked it plainly, without the formal register, without the diplomatic padding. He asked it the way a person asks something when they genuinely do not know the answer. "What are you people?" he said. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about my mother, who had taught me my first veil words when I was 6 years old. I thought about the archives, and the 300 years of careful, patient, unbroken listening. I thought about the Rethkai courier who had taken a 60-year secret to their grave and then, at the moment of greatest need, had trusted us with it. I told him exactly what we were, the ones who listened. For 300 years, we listened to everything, and we never forgot a single word. My name is Evra Solis, and I am standing at a window. This sounds simple, but it is not simple, because the window looks out onto a docking bay, and in that docking bay, right now, there are ships that are not from Earth. That sentence, stated plainly, still does not fully communicate what it means to stand here and see it with my own eyes. There are alien ships in our port. There are beings from other worlds walking through corridors that, 1 year ago, no living human had ever shared with another species. The air scrubbers had to be reconfigured. The lighting in certain sections had to be adjusted. The catering staff spent 3 months learning what various species could and could not consume, a project that produced one of the most unusual documents ever filed in the history of Earth's civil service. I watched a Rethkai diplomat cross the main concourse of the Luna Spire this morning, moving in that unhurried way their people have, and she paused to look out at the stars through the observation dome, and I found myself wondering what it looked like to her, looking out at space from a place she had never been, a place her people had known about for 60 years but had never seen, and feeling whatever it is the Rethkai feel when something surprises them. I thought about all the mornings I had sat in the archive and read their transmissions. I thought about how different it was to see one of them in person, real and present and not a signal on a screen. The Geneva Accord of 2401 was signed 14 months after that first message. It did not come easily. Nothing about any of this came easily. The Veiled Dominion sent 11 delegations over the course of 7 months, each one more senior than the last, each one arriving at our table with new concerns, new demands, new discoveries from their own intelligence services about the extent of what we knew. We were patient with all of them. Patient was the one thing we had always been very good at. Admiral Vell attended in person at the 5th session. He looked exactly like his communications profile suggested he would. He was older than I had expected, somehow. More tired. He sat across the table from our delegation, and he looked at the people of Earth the way you look at something that has reorganized your understanding of the world, and he said, near the end of that session, something I have thought about many times since. He said, "We never thought to look for someone who was not trying to be seen." He was right about that. That had been the entire point. The Accord itself covered several foundational areas. It established Earth as a recognized galactic power with full legal standing under existing interstellar frameworks, which was mostly a formality at that point but a necessary one. It established a mutual non-aggression framework binding on all signatories. It created a permanent diplomatic council with representatives from 14 civilizations, meeting quarterly in rotation across member systems. And it established the Rethkai as a protected neutral courier service under multilateral guarantee, which meant no single power could pressure or threaten them without triggering a collective response. The Dominion signed. They were not happy about all of it. Happiness was not the goal. Stability was the goal, and the Dominion, for all their power and all their long history of doing as they pleased, were intelligent enough to understand that the world had changed and that signing was better than the alternative. The alternative, which we had made clear in quiet terms without any theatrics, was that Earth would publish its complete archive of 300 years of monitoring, in full, translated into every major language in the region, and allow every civilization that had ever been misled or manipulated or quietly targeted by the Dominion to read exactly what we had found. We never had to do it. The offer was enough. The Karathi Collective observed the summit for 3 months before they sent a representative. They sent a single individual, older than anyone else in the room by several centuries, who sat and listened for 4 sessions before speaking. When they spoke, they said they had reviewed our open transmissions going back to the beginning of our monitoring program, and they wished to know why we had chosen silence rather than contact when we first detected galactic civilization. I answered that question myself, because it was mine to answer. I told them about the Covenant of Silence. I told them about the room in 2089, and the decision made there, and the generations of people who had maintained it. I told them that it was a decision made out of humility, not fear, a recognition that we did not yet know enough to speak responsibly, and that the consequences of speaking badly were too significant to risk. The Karathi representative considered this for a long time. You understood, they said at last, that introduction cannot be undone. Yes, I said. We underestimated that kind of patience, they said. We will not make that mistake again. I do not know exactly what they meant by that. The Karathi rarely meant exactly one thing. But they signed the accord, which was what mattered operationally, and their representative stayed for 2 additional sessions to ask questions that were extraordinarily precise and that gave me the sense that they were doing something very similar to what we had spent 300 years doing, studying carefully, learning everything they could, before they committed to anything. I respected that. I understood it more than I could easily say. The Pale Architects sent nothing to the summit. They were not represented. They sent no message of support and no message of objection. They simply did not appear, which was consistent with everything we knew of them and which made me no less curious about what they thought. 3 weeks after the accord was signed, a single Pale Architect transmission arrived at our monitoring station. It was addressed to Earth, as the Rethkai message had been, directly, precisely, with no ambiguity about the intended recipient. It was short. 11 words in a language that our analysts had been working to understand for a very long time. We wondered when you would speak. I read those 11 words and sat with them for a while. There was something in them that moved me in a way I could not fully articulate. Not surprise, we had always wondered whether the Pale Architects, the oldest ones, might have known about us in some way that the others had not. But confirmation of suspicion and actual confirmation are different feelings, and the difference matters. They had been watching. Perhaps for a very long time. And they had said nothing, just as we had said nothing, and now we had both finally spoken, and there was something in that parallel that felt significant in a way that would take me years to fully understand. I went back to the archive the week after the accord was signed. I needed to. I had been living in the middle of the new world for so long, the world of meetings and translations and negotiations and adjustments, that I needed to go back to the beginning and remember what it had all been built on. The archive is enormous. It fills level after level of the Geneva facility, row after row of stored signal data going back to the first decoded transmission in 2089. It is not a glamorous place. It smells like recycled air and old server components. The lighting is flat and functional. But I have always loved it in a way I do not love many places, because it is the place where 300 years of patience became 300 years of knowledge, and that transformation happened here, in these rooms, in the work of people who gave their careers and sometimes their lives to a silence that the world above them did not even know was being maintained. I walked the lower levels for 2 hours. I read plaques on the walls that listed the names of analysts who had retired or passed away without ever knowing whether the silence would end in their lifetimes. Most of them had known it would not. They had done the work anyway. They had done it because they understood that some contributions are made for people who come after, not for recognition that arrives during your own time. I stood in front of the very first server bank, the one that contained the original decoded signals from 2089, and I thought about the people in that cold room all those years ago, looking at what they had found and making the decision they made. They were right. Not just tactically, not just strategically, they were right in a deeper way that is harder to express. They looked at a galaxy full of voices and understood that the worst thing they could do was add a new voice before they knew what the others were saying. They chose to listen first. To understand first. To be ready before they spoke. And when we finally spoke, we spoke from a position of knowledge so complete that no one in the galaxy could dismiss us, manipulate us, mislead us, or use our ignorance against us. We walked into the room already knowing who was in it. We sat down at the table already knowing the history of every person across from us. We negotiated from a foundation that 300 years of patient, invisible work had built. That is not something you can rush. That is not something you can shortcut. That is the reward for a very specific kind of courage, the courage to wait, to listen, to resist the very human impulse to announce yourself before you are ready. I was still thinking about all of this when I heard a small voice behind me. I turned around and found a child. She was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, looking up at me with large golden eyes that marked her immediately as Rethkai. She was the daughter of one of the Rethkai diplomatic staff, I learned later, a family that had been granted residence at the Luna Spire while the early phases of the Accord implementation were underway. She had apparently wandered away from the visitor orientation and found her way into the archive through a door that someone had failed to close properly. She looked around at the rows of servers and the flat lighting and the plaques on the walls, and then she looked back at me with an expression that was deeply serious for someone her age. "Why were you quiet for so long?" she asked. It was not a rude question. Children rarely ask rude questions. They ask honest ones, which is more valuable and sometimes more difficult to answer. I thought about what to say. I thought about all the ways to explain it, the tactical reasons, the strategic reasons, the historical reasons, the fear of speaking before we were ready. I thought about 300 years of people making the same choice, generation after generation, maintaining something invisible and essential and never once losing faith that it mattered. Then I knelt down so that I was at her eye level, and I looked at her golden eyes, and I told her what my grandfather told me, what his grandmother told him, passed down through all the silent centuries. "You only get one chance to walk into a room for the first time," I said. "Make sure you know exactly who is in it before you open the door." She blinked at me. She was quiet for a moment, the way children sometimes are when they are actually thinking instead of simply waiting for the conversation to be over. Then she nodded, slowly, like she understood. I think she did. I stood back up and looked out at the server banks, at the accumulated weight of 300 years of listening, and I thought that maybe this was the truest thing the silence had ever given us. Not the Accord. Not the fleet. Not the seat at the table or the fear in the Dominion's councils or the respect in the Korathi representatives' precise questions. This, that there was a child from another world standing next to me in our archive, asking why we had waited so long, and that the answer made complete sense to her. We had built something here that outlasted its original purpose. We had built, through 3 centuries of quiet work, the foundation of something new, a way of moving through the galaxy that was not built on dominance or fear or speed, but on understanding. On listening. On the belief that knowing who is in the room before you open the door is not a small thing. It is everything. Outside the window, the docking bay was busy. Ships moved through the guidance lanes with the careful precision of crews still learning new protocols, new hand signals, new ways of sharing space with people they had never shared space with before. Inside the archive, the servers hummed the way they had always hummed, quiet and constant, full of everything we had ever learned about a galaxy that had not known we were there. We were there now. Fully, finally, without apology and without pretense. The silence had ended. What came next was ours to build.